So just for some context, my name's Jim Adams. Been mushroom hunting for over 20 years. Grew up in the North Bay area, which is definitely a great place to grow up if you're into the outdoors and fungus and mushrooms and things like that. Former member of the Mycological Society of San Francisco and the Fungus Federation of Santa Cruz, as well as the Los Angeles Mycological Society. Just a side note, Los Angeles is a really sad place to be a mushroom hunter. You have to drive and drive and drive to get to anywhere that's really worth a foray. Forays where you go out and look for mushrooms. But you know, it did expose me to the world of desert fungi. So there's all different kinds of mushrooms and other macrofungi that come up in the desert occasionally when it rains, and they have a bunch of different specimens that they bring out, particularly for their annual mushroom show. So if you're ever interested in learning about desert fungi, that's a really great place to go and explore. And you know, I have a love for exploring the outdoors. And so coming across some mushrooms or some other macrofungi while I'm doing a hike is one of my favorite things. And I love kind of taking pictures to kind of memorialize those finds. Everything you see today will be pictures I've taken either with a little iPod or my phone. So nothing too sophisticated in terms of equipment or anything like that. And just a little outline of what we'll talk about today. We're gonna go over where to find mushrooms both locally and regionally, when to go out to try and find them, when to time your outings. I am gonna do a bonus on how to find morel mushrooms, because we had a lot of success this last year, and I think I've kind of honed down some of those key things to look for, and we'll help you find them as well, and then just some cool mushroom pictures. So there are some, unfortunately, pretty significant limitations on hunting for mushrooms here in the Central Valley. So pretty much all of the native vegetation and the soil has been plowed under multiple times since white people came to California back in the mid-1800s. So if you're familiar with fungus, they really, many types live in the soil or in the leaf litter or on dead and decaying wood that's down. And so without any of that habitat, we don't have any of those mushrooms. Similarly, over in riparian areas where you might see more trees and other kind of habitat that would be good for mushrooms, those areas have also been pretty heavily disturbed in the last 170 years. So whether it's dredging for gold and kind of digging up all the soil and trees and bushes that are out, like on the American River Parkway, or the construction of the levees where they kind of had to denude the creek banks and then create new banks that are further out. It really killed off a lot of the fungal diversity here in the Central Valley. One of the exceptions to this rule is the Davis area. They've managed to maintain a lot of their native oaks, or the oaks that they do have been there for 70, 100, 150 years. And so they have pretty extensive fungal diversity. If you go out to the UC Davis campus, there's a lot of different stuff that'll come up under the oaks that they have. Unfortunately, one of the drawbacks with Davis is there aren't really any legal collecting areas. So if you found some really choice edibles, like some bluets under some oaks, there's not really a place where you can legally take those and feel safe that somebody isn't going to give you a ticket. Although those kinds of things are relatively rare. It just depends on where you are and what kind of an official sees you. So I kind of looked at a map of Sacramento County and all of our different parklands to see kind of where have I been and where my opportunities be to go mushroom hunting. So obviously the American River Parkway is a pretty big area that has a lot of natural features. Unfortunately, ever since I moved to Sacramento, I spent probably 4 years going out there in the fall and winter to try and find mushrooms, and really have only ever found 3 or 4 different varieties, and they're not very abundant. And I think it has to do with this not a really natural habitat, even though it appears so. It just doesn't have enough time to recover from all the disturbance that has happened over the last 150, 170 years. Out east is where we have a lot of our native oaks, so like around Folsom Lake or the Deer Creek Hills. Unfortunately, most of these areas, it's not legal to go collecting. So for example, in the Deer Creek Hills, you're not allowed to go off the trails and you can't be collecting anything and bringing it home. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for some photography, finding some interesting mushrooms out around Folsom Lake and down in the Deer Creek Hills, but probably not a great opportunity to go and find something to bring back home to eat. I have gone down to Rancho Seco and the Consumnes River Preserve down in South County and have never found anything other than like some lichen or kind of little brown mushrooms here and there. So unfortunately not a lot of kind of great mushroom habitat right here locally. But what we do have is urban mushroom hunting. So one of the things I like to do is see what's fruiting either on some of the old trees that we have or in some of the landscaping areas. So back when the Sacramento Natural Foods Co-op redid some of their landscaping, they put out a bunch of new wood chips, and for about a year after they would irrigate, there would be flushes of morel mushrooms coming up. And so every once in a while you'd see people kind of stooping down around the plants and picking up dinner for the night. So you can find some things in lawns, other areas that are irrigated. Another main area that I go for mushroom hunting here in the city is some of these old street trees. So a lot of them are starting to hit the end of their lives, and they're a lot more vulnerable and susceptible to infections from fungus that younger trees aren't. They're not particularly parasitic. These aren't what are killing these trees, but they're kind of opportunists in coming out. So here on the left, I think that is a reishi lingqi, but it's got a weird form to it, so it's relatively harder to identify accurately. And polypores are a little bit harder to identify based on some of the books I use, because it's not something that a lot of people are looking for, and so they don't go into as much depth on the polypores, which are these harder, longer-lived fungi. Over on the right are some chicken of the woods, or chicken of the city. One of the things you do want to look out for with these mushrooms in particular is if they're growing on a eucalyptus species, they tend to pull out some of the chemicals in that eucalyptus tree, and they tend to give people upset stomachs. Not particularly deadly toxic or anything, but something most people try to avoid because it does get some people sick sometimes. So it would not be a talk about Sacramento if we didn't talk about how close we are to other places that we can visit. So the national forests are really going to be the main location that you're going to want to go to find mushrooms that you can legally collect and bring home. State parks are really great because they have a really wide diversity of habitats and fungal diversity. Unfortunately, they don't generally allow you to collect the mushrooms that you find there and bring them home. You will get a ranger that is very upset at you if you try and do that and they find you. Depending on where you go, there's a couple of state parks over on the coast that are kind of the exception to that rule, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we'll discuss some of these specific national forests and kind of particular places you can go in some of the next slides. But there's also areas to the north. So the Plumas National Forest really had amazing habitat for a long time, particularly along the Oro-Quincy Highway. Unfortunately, the fires over the last 4 or 5 years or so have really decimated the area. When these really intense fires come through, it burns the soil down to the mineral rocks that have been decomposed there, and so there's not a lot of substrate for those fungus to be able to live in and then kind of fruit some mushrooms out of. Lassen National Park is a little ambiguous about whether you can take your collections home, but the Lassen National Forest that's around it is really lenient. They're actually encouraging people to go out and do mushroom hunting. They actually don't have any limits on collecting other than king boletes and morels, which are limited to 5 pounds a person for the season, which is pretty significant in the scheme of things, and particularly in relation to some of the other forests. More than that, then you start needing to get permits and things. The Shasta Trinity National Forest is pretty highly regulated. They have limits on collecting both in specific locations and then specific times of year. And they have a pretty robust permit system. You can collect up to a gallon of mushrooms in that area, again, as long as you're following the restrictions on location and timing. The Mendocino National Forest is about the same. They have really intense pressure from commercial collectors, and so they have stricter limits and significant permit processes in place to try and kind of regulate that. So specifically closer to us, the Tahoe National Forest is really close. It's just up Highway 80. They're a little bit ambiguous about what their collection limits are and what requires a permit. Generally, with a lot of these forests, the limit is about a gallon of mushrooms, and if you think of a gallon, that's 16 cups. It's a pretty big volume of mushrooms, so I think you can go out and collect pretty well without too much of a problem. Recently logged areas in these national forests can be less prolific just because it's been stripped of a lot of that organic material and there's been a lot of disturbance, but sometimes you can find mushrooms that appreciate that disturbance. So as you're going out and looking about where to go, I tend to go to intact forests rather than places that have been freshly logged. Similarly, the fire, as I mentioned before with Loomis, when there's a fire that goes through an area, sometimes that really limits the fungal diversity for a few years, or if it's a really intense fire, maybe a few decades. So our group tends to go to the Bullard's Bar area. That's where the black circle's around, kind of at the base of the national forest. I expect once we get some rains in, I'll be bringing people out there again. Depending on how far north the summer thunderstorms get, the Highway 20 corridor, particularly as you get up to Highway 80, is a really great place to find a lot of diversity. Generally, the thunderstorm activity in the summer tends to be like Tahoe South, but if you notice that it's gotten up into the northern part of the Sierras, you can find stuff in August and September during a season when we don't really have anything down here or in the foothills. So kind of keeping an eye out for the weather changes that happen up in the Sierras can be helpful if you want to go for some mushroom hunting in the summer. Then further south on Highway 80, if you go off of Texas Hill Road, there's a lot of really diverse habitat down there. It's a relatively highly impacted recreational area. There's a lot of people that go out there for camping or shooting or all different kinds of things that you do in the national forest. But when I've gone out there, I haven't seen a lot of mushroom hunters. So they have like meadows and pine forests, small lakes, firs. So that provides a lot of different habitat where you can find different types of mushrooms. Then further south, off of Highway 50, is the El Dorado National Forest. It is probably the premier spot to do morel hunting in this state at this point because of the fires that have been there. We had really good success earlier this year out there, and so we'll continue to be hitting this place up. So the Wentworth Springs Road that goes out of Georgetown and past Stumpy Meadows Lake, that was an area that we would go pretty frequently. It has pretty good diversity both in the fall and in the spring. There has been some pretty heavy logging there in the past 5 years, unfortunately, so it's kind of stripped out a lot of that habitat. But I did notice they left a lot of the area north of the lake free of that cutting, so there is still some habitat out there to go check out. Further south, the Mormon Emigrant Trail goes from Pollock Pines on Highway 50 down or up to the mountains in, is that Alpine County? Off of Highway 88 towards Kirkwood. That was a really great place to go. We would go out to like Fleming Meadows and just along the sides of the road up there, and there would be a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of boletes in the fall, a lot of other interesting, sometimes some morels in the spring. The Caldor fire has gone through there though and really wiped out a lot of that habitat. So I don't know if we'll be going back there for a fall hunt for a while, just because it needs some time to kind of rebuild those soils and that fungal diversity. So further up the hill is Union Valley Reservoir and Loon Lake. Those are really nice habitat for exploring both in the fall and in the spring. For the fall, it really depends on how soon we get snow up there. It's at about 5,800 feet, so it's not super high up, but sometimes the roads getting up there are a little bit higher and can get blocked by the snow. So snow is generally not super friendly for finding mushrooms. So the collecting limits here in the El Dorado National Forest are that 1 gallon limit of mushrooms per person per year. They do have a really good permit system. You can go to any of these forest offices, which are the red dots up here, and get a $20 permit to collect up to 40 pounds of mushrooms. And so like during the morel season, people were getting those, but there was a line out the door to get those permits in the morning. Then further south is the Stanislaus National Forest. So it generally takes about 2 hours plus to get there from Sacramento. So our group hasn't really gone out there too much in organized trips. It's kind of on the edge of day trip length. But it does have a large variety of habitats, and it's been somewhat less impacted by wildfires over the last few years. Some of the special places I like around this forest are areas around Calaveras Big Tree State Park. Unfortunately, in Calaveras Big Trees, you can't be collecting things and taking them, but that whole area is kind of an upper foothills, lower mountains habitat range. So you get things that'll come up in the foothills and things that'll come up in the mountains in the same location. So that gives you a little bit more of an opportunity to find more diversity and more things that you might be interested in collecting. If you continue up Highway 4 to Dorrington or up into the alpine areas, it just has even more different habitats that you can go to. Really just finding a place where you can safely park your car off the side of the road will provide you access to a lot of different habitat, and you just kind of go and walk and see what's out. And we'll talk about timing on when's the best to do those explorations a little bit later. Pinecrest Lake down on Highway 108 is also a really great place to go. They have tons of pine trees, so that would be a really great place to find boletes in the fall, and potentially in the spring as well as the snow melts. They have the same collection limits as the El Dorado National Forest, so that's the gallon per person per year. So then if we go the other direction out west, the coast is full of really great collecting locations. So the North Bay, where I grew up, open space is a big thing. So they just have areas that are free of development and mostly natural. And like in Marin County, the open space district doesn't allow collecting, but there is a lot of habitat to go out and explore. In the East Bay, the East Bay Municipal Utility District has a lot of lands, as well as the East Bay Park System. Taking a hike around some of the reservoirs, you can find a lot of fungal diversity, and just generally those hills tend to be a little bit more interesting in terms of mushrooms coming up than some of the flatlands closer to the bay. Down in the South Bay, Santa Cruz is like the spot. If you love mushroom hunting, Santa Cruz is the place to go. I was privileged enough to spend 4 years down there and learn with some experts on kind of the insane diversity and wide array of different types of mushrooms that you're going to find there, and particularly the edible mushrooms like chanterelles and bluets and porcinis, things like that. You're generally looking for areas with old trees, forests, oaks, pines, redwoods. Those are kind of, each of those tree communities has different mushrooms that are associated with them and that come out on a regular basis. Fall Creek in the Big Basin Redwood State Park is one of my favorite places to go in Santa Cruz because it doesn't have a lot of people and it has a wide variety of different fungus. The Soquel Demonstration State Forest is a different kind of state managed property, and so they sell, or they have available personal collecting permits where in the state parks you're not allowed to collect down there. Further up in the peninsula on Highway 35, which is Skyline Boulevard, there's a lot of parks there as well, and similarly open space. So other than Salt Point State Park, there's not really a lot of legal collecting areas down there. The Point Reyes National Seashore in Marin County also allows collecting. Their limit is, I think, 2 pounds per person per year, which is not a ton, but it's enough to have a couple of meals. I tend to have a couple of chanterelle spots in the mountains out there that are pretty regular and prolific. So going for a hike in the uplands of Point Reyes National Seashores is a really great place to find some mushrooms. So I think if you're really looking to get more experience in the Bay Area, going out with one of their local mycological societies is a really good idea. We're part of, in Sacramento area mushroomers, we're part of the North American Mycological Association. So there's a good chance if you contact like a 4A organizer for one of those clubs down in the Bay Area, you can say, hey, I'm a NAMA affiliated club member. Do you mind if I come out with you on your next 4A? And they can hopefully get you signed up so that you can join them on their next trip. So further north, we had talked about the Plumas, Lassen, and Mendocino National Forests. It's a little harder to get there these days with gas prices the way they've been, but if you're privileged enough to be able to make those trips, they're definitely areas to go to. The Plumas and Lassen and Mendocino National Forests are mostly on our schedule in terms of when mushrooms come up, so that's kind of later November into December usually, depending on the rain that we get. If you go further north, like in Humboldt County, their season tends to be a few weeks earlier. So if you go kind of mid-November, maybe Thanksgiving, you're going to find a lot more mushrooms and a lot more diversity than you're going to find out in the foothills and the mountains here. Unfortunately, it's another one of those locations where a lot of the collecting sites are going to be state parks or national parks that don't allow you to take things home. So, one of the things I've been privileged enough to do is take trips in the early fall to the Pacific Northwest. So if you're really like needing some mushroom hunting and it's October and we're getting no rain, I highly recommend going up to Washington or Oregon. In Washington, you can go around like the Olympic National Park and the Olympic National Forest, the Cascades, Mount Rainier, and usually late October is when things tend to peak for that area. So like I'll take a Halloween trip up to the Olympic National Park and there's just mushrooms everywhere. And then I come back here and it's dry and sad and there's no mushrooms for weeks. Up in Oregon, Mount Hood is a really great place to go, as well as the Willamette National Forest. And they're a couple weeks later, more like mid-November. So then a little bit more locally, when to go out to look for mushrooms. So we've talked about places where you can go, and when you're timing your outings is really going to depend on the amount of moisture that we're getting. Mushrooms need that moisture to get started, to kind of get their roots out and meet other fungi, organisms, and then create that fruiting body of the mushroom that you're looking for. So that's going to take some time after the first rains. If you go out the first weekend after a rain, you're probably not going to find too much because there hasn't been that opportunity for these things to grow. So I tend to go between 10 days and 2 weeks after you get about an inch of rain up in the foothills or the mountains. Another thing you want to think about is what you're looking for when you're going out. So this first flush is going to be things like boletes and some russulas and other early season fungi. As you get later in the season, you're going to get other types of fungi that come up, other types of mushrooms like chanterelles or some of those more fleshy fungi that take a little bit longer to get themselves going. It is important that there's continual moisture during the season. So if we get one really big rain and then it's dry for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, there's going to be one flush of mushrooms in response to the rain, but it's kind of going to peter out that season. So you're going to want to see at least some moisture coming through at least every 2 weeks to keep new mushrooms coming up throughout the season. So over in winter, what's still out and fruiting in January, right? A lot of the mushrooms are shorter lived, and so they'll come out after the initial rains and then they kind of die back after. So what you're looking for in the winter are things that are triggered by the colder weather or that are longer lived species. One of the things that's pretty detrimental to mushroom hunting here in the foothills and the mountains is a hard freeze. So when the ground freezes, that stops all that fungal activity, all of the mycelium from kind of meeting each other and creating new mushrooms. So there are some exceptions to that rule. So like if we have a hard freeze and then it warms up really quickly afterwards, it's still a reasonably good time to go out. I've been out in the El Dorado National Forest when there's a very small layer of snow on the ground and there's a bunch of mushrooms underneath it because it had warmed up enough to keep things moving. So spring. Spring has a lot of interesting mushrooms that come up as the snow melts. So in the lower foothills where there's not snow, you're not going to find much of a spring mushroom season, but once you get up into the mountains and into the pines, you're going to find a lot more that's coming up, like spring king boletes and the morels. So one of the things you're looking for, in particular if you're looking for morels, is these fire scars. So this is a picture we took up at the South Fork Road where we went hunting and had a really good success this last year. So this is an area that was in the King Fire. So that's, I think, 4 years ago. I'm not exactly sure what year that main fire was, but it had gone through, they had done their logging, but you'll notice that there's still a lot of living trees up here. And so part of that fire intensity issue is when it's really intense, it denudes all the trees die after a year. That's not a great place to look for morel mushrooms because there's not a lot of soil left. You want to find places where maybe the first layer of the needles of the pine trees have burned off, but there's still soil, and then there's a new layer of pine needles from the most recent year's growth. Over here on the right, so you're looking for areas that the snow has melted, but not completely. So like in shaded spots or in like a downhill area that doesn't get much sun, there should still be maybe a little bit of snow around. And that seems to be an indicator, for me at least, that I'm not too late for an area. Oh, sorry, one more. For fire, so where to find where there's been fires. I will often do a Google search of fire maps, California, and the year that I'm looking, like the last year or a couple years ago. And that'll give me a sense of where in the state they had significant fires, and if there's something close by, I'll look up what the name of that fire is, and then I look up a map of Caldor fire map and find out specifically from usually CAL FIRE the footprint or the area that fire burned. And then I can kind of line that up with like a Google map of where the roads are, so I know how I can access those areas safely. So there are companion fungi that tend to come along with the morels. So these ones are usually found together. I don't know how I got a picture of them separately because they're almost always kind of really close by or mixed up with each other. These ones come out usually a week or 2 weeks before the morels come out. So when I was here, I realized that I was too early. I was not going to find really any morels in this area because it hadn't been enough time for that mycelium to develop and to create the mushrooms. For morels, you're looking between 3,000 and 9,000 feet. The lower areas start first, but does depend on having snow down to that lower level to provide the moisture for them to get started. And so the season slowly goes up the mountain until it hits the point where there isn't any forest anymore or any more snow. Aren't they pretty? So I don't know if you see the hidden morel, but they're kind of always hidden. Once you go out there and you find your first one, they start popping up everywhere. So I tend to call that like having your mushroom eyes on, being able to kind of see those things that are coming up. Generally, south and east-facing slopes tend to do better than north and west-facing slopes. It has to do with kind of that snow melt process and how long it takes and how much moisture stays in the ground. This one on the right is starting to get a little crispy on the top. This year, we did not get a lot of supplemental rains in the spring. Oftentimes, we'll get another, like a round of rain in March or April up in the mountains that'll kind of refresh the soil and keep things moist and keep these mushrooms growing. When we got there, they were starting to kind of be done, but they were still really good edibles. And I find them just very photogenic mushrooms. Just seeing kind of the light filter through the back is one of my favorite things. You're kind of, as I said, working your way up the hill as the season progresses. If you notice in the area that you're hunting that there really aren't any morels, rather than moving to a different location, I would recommend moving in a different elevation, usually higher. Sometimes it's lower, just depends on kind of where the snow melt is compared to where you are and how much you're finding. The season starts in March, May. It really depends on the snowpack and how thick it was and how long it takes to start melting. It lasts for about 6 weeks or so, again, depending on how much moisture is left in the soil to keep those mushrooms coming up. All right. So I had a really good day out, and I actually had almost twice that much, but because I'm not eating them, I just gave them to people who didn't find as many on the foray that we went on. And you know, they're really unique, beautiful mushrooms. I just love the shot of the small one over there on the right. So then moving on to just cool pictures. I was not able to get species identification on all of these. I'm sorry that I'm kind of a bad mushroom hunter in that I take the shot and then I kind of lose my interest in figuring out specifically what mushroom that was. I think this one down on the bottom is a puffball from up in the Sierras. This Rhoeoporus was really interesting. It's a polypore, so it doesn't have the gills of a normal mushroom. It has these kind of like spongy, tubey things on the bottom of it. And then over on the right is a relatively famous Amanita muscaria, and supposedly poisonous. I don't know. I don't eat any Amanitas personally. I stay away from the whole classification of mushrooms. They're just a little bit more dangerous than I'm up for. Some pictures from the Pacific Northwest. This gray one was actually kind of silver. It had like a metallic sheen to it, so that was a really fun one to find. The middle one, I'm pretty sure is a Russula. The cap color is very green, which is not a common color in Russulas, and I could not key out which one it was. But on the right is the Pacific Golden Foot Chanterelle, I think is what they call it. They're hollow in the middle, which is a good indicator of which mushroom that is, and another one of the choice edibles. This little jelly fungus with the teeth is one of my favorites. Just so it's a little tiny mushroom, but it's just so delicate and intricate and almost translucent. And then on the right is a white chanterelle that got really filthy dirty when I picked it out of the ground and ended up not being very useful for eating. But it was really cool find. I had never found a white chanterelle before, so that was kind of cool. And then my last pictures here are a very gelatinous, like there's a good 1/4 inch of just gelatinous stuff on the top of that mushroom on the left. And then I'm pretty sure that that's a Cortinarius on the right, but the stalk is kind of pitted, and so that's not a feature that's very common in Cortinarius. So I've been trying to figure out what on earth I took a picture of for a minute, but it's so pretty. It's so pretty.